What happens when Hollywood's most beloved father figure walks into what should be a celebration of his incredible career, only to face a vicious attack from a host who's harboring decades of professional jealousy? Henry Winkler thought he was appearing on Jimmy Kimmel Live to promote his latest project and share some laughs with millions of viewers. Instead, he walked into an ambush that would expose the ugly side of a comedian who built his career on other people's failures. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, because what you're about to witness will change how you see late-night television forever. The green room at Jimmy Kimmel Live buzzed with the usual pre-show energy as Henry Winkler prepared for what he assumed would be another pleasant late-night appearance. At 78 years old, the beloved actor had done thousands of interviews over his decades in Hollywood, and they had become almost routine. Tonight was supposed to be special, though, a chance to talk about his children's book series and maybe share some stories from his legendary career spanning from Happy Days to Barry. Henry had always enjoyed his appearances on Kimmel's show. The host had seemed genuine in their previous interactions, respectful of Henry's legacy while still maintaining that irreverent comedy style that made him popular with younger audiences. There had never been any tension between them, no reason to expect anything other than the usual friendly banter and promotional content that defined most late-night interviews. The makeup artist put the finishing touches on Henry's appearance while he mentally prepared the anecdotes he might share. Stories about Ron Howard, tales from the Happy Days set, maybe something about working with Bill Hader on Barry. These were the kinds of stories audiences loved, the behind-the-scenes glimpses into beloved television shows that had shaped Americans' culture. As Henry walked onto the stage, the audience erupted in genuine affection. These weren't just polite talk show applause. These were people who had grown up watching the Fonz, who had discovered him again through Arrested Development, and who had recently fallen in love with his dramatic work on Barry. The warmth was palpable, and Henry waved with his characteristic humility and grace. "Henry Winkler, everybody," Jimmy announced as Henry took his seat. But something in the host's tone felt different. Where there should have been warmth and respect, there was something that sounded almost mocking. "The Fonz himself, gracing us with his presence." "Jimmy, always a pleasure," Henry replied with his genuine smile, settling into the guest chair with the easy comfort of someone who had been doing this for decades. "So, Henry, let's talk about your incredible career," Jimmy began, but his posture suggested this wasn't going to be the celebration Henry had anticipated. 50-plus years in Hollywood, multiple generations knowing your work. You must feel pretty good about your legacy. Henry sensed something off in the phrasing but responded with his usual graciousness. "I feel incredibly grateful, Jimmy, to have had the opportunity to work with so many talented people, to be part of shows that meant something to audiences. It's been a gift." "A gift," Jimmy repeated, his voice carrying a slight edge that Henry couldn't quite place. "That's interesting, because I've been thinking about your career, Henry, and I'm curious about something." The audience was still warm and welcoming, but Henry felt a chill run down his spine. There was something predatory in Jimmy's tone, something that suggested this wasn't going to be the friendly interview he had expected. "What's that, Jimmy?" Henry asked, his smile becoming slightly more forced. "Well, you've had this incredible run of success, this beloved status in Hollywood. But I keep wondering how much of that is really about talent and how much is just about being in the right place at the right time." The question hit Henry like a slap. In all his years of interviews, through all the ups and downs of his career, no one had ever questioned his fundamental talent so directly or so publicly. The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was wrong. "I'm not sure I understand what you're getting at," Henry replied, his voice carrying a note of confusion and growing concern. "What I'm getting at, Henry, is that you've built this whole career on essentially one character, the Fonz. Everything else has just been variations on that same cool guy persona, hasn't it?" Henry felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just professional criticism. This was a systematic attack on everything he had worked for throughout his entire career. Jimmy, I think that's incredibly unfair. If you look at my body of work, from comedy to drama, from acting to producing to writing. Sure, sure, Jimmy interrupted with obvious dismissiveness. But let's be honest here, Henry. Without Happy Days, without that one lucky break, where would you be? You weren't exactly setting the world on fire before that show came along. The studio fell uncomfortably quiet. This wasn't the usual late-night banter that audiences expected. This was something much more personal and cruel, and it was happening to someone that most people genuinely loved and respected. Lucky break? Henry's voice was rising slightly, his famous composure beginning to crack. Jimmy, I auditioned for that role like everyone else. I worked to create that character, to make him meaningful to people. Worked to create him? Jimmy's laugh was sharp and mocking. Henry, you played a guy who said, "Ay," and snapped his fingers. How much creative work could that possibly have required? Henry stared at Jimmy in disbelief. This wasn't professional disagreement or even harsh criticism. This was deliberate humiliation, and it was coming from someone he had trusted to treat him with basic respect. You know what, Jimmy? I think you're being incredibly disrespectful right now, Henry said, his voice carrying decades of accumulated dignity and strength. Disrespectful? Jimmy leaned forward, his expression becoming more aggressive. I'm being honest, Henry. I'm asking questions that maybe should have been asked a long time ago. The audience was now visibly uncomfortable, some looking around nervously as if expecting someone to intervene. This had moved far beyond entertainment into something that felt genuinely cruel and unnecessary. Questions about what? Henry demanded, his anger now clearly visible. About whether you've earned all this adoration, or whether you've just been coasting on nostalgia for 50 years. The accusation hung in the air like poison, and Henry Winkler felt something fundamental shift inside him. This wasn't just professional criticism anymore. This was a deliberate attempt to destroy his reputation and legacy in front of millions of people. The man sitting across from him bore no resemblance to the Jimmy Kimmel he thought he knew. Coasting on nostalgia? Henry's voice carried a strength that surprised even him. Jimmy, do you have any idea what you're talking about? Do you know anything about my career beyond what you read on Wikipedia? I know enough, Jimmy shot back, his voice dripping with condescension. I know you've been playing the same lovable character for decades, just with different names and different shows. The same character? Henry was incredulous. Have you watched Barry? Have you seen my work on Arrested Development? Do you think those performances came from nowhere? Jimmy waved dismissively. Barry. Right. The show where you play a slightly different version of the same supportive older man you always play. Very challenging stuff, Henry. The audience was now clearly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and exchanging worried glances. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was cruelty, and they were being forced to witness it. You know what, Jimmy? Henry stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I don't know what this is really about, but I'm not going to sit here and let you tear down my life's work for your entertainment. Sit down, Henry, Jimmy said, his voice carrying a commanding tone that revealed something ugly about his personality. We're not done here. Yes, we are, Henry replied firmly. This isn't an interview, it's an ambush, and I won't be part of it. Jimmy also stood, moving around his desk with predatory confidence. An ambush? I'm asking you legitimate questions about your career. If you can't handle that, maybe that says something about how solid that career really is. Legitimate questions? Henry's voice was rising, his famous composure completely gone now. You're not asking questions, Jimmy. You're making accusations. You're trying to tear down someone who's never done anything to hurt you. The studio was electric with tension. Camera operators were looking at each other nervously. Production staff were whispering frantically. And the audience sat frozen, watching two men they had respected destroy each other in ways that felt deeply personal. Never done anything to hurt me? Jimmy's laugh was bitter and revealing. You want to know what you did to hurt me, Henry? Please enlighten me, Henry replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm that was completely unlike his usual gentle demeanor. You represent everything that's wrong with this industry, Jimmy said, his professional mask finally slipping completely. You represent the idea that mediocrity gets rewarded as long as it's wrapped in false humility and fake niceness. Henry stared at Jimmy in shock. This wasn't about his career anymore. This was about something much deeper and more twisted. False humility? Fake niceness? Jimmy, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that you've built an entire persona around being this wonderful, humble guy, when really you're just another actor who got lucky and has been milking that luck ever since. Milking that luck? Henry's voice cracked with emotion. Jimmy, I've worked every single day for 50 years. I've taken roles others wouldn't take. I've supported young actors. I've written books for children. How is any of that milking luck? Because it's all performance, Jimmy replied viciously. The nice guy act, the supportive mentor routine, the humble veteran who's just grateful to be here. It's all carefully calculated to maintain your image. Henry felt like he'd been physically assaulted. These weren't professional criticisms. These were personal attacks on his character, his integrity, everything he believed about himself and his life's work. You think being kind is an act? Henry asked, his voice now carrying genuine hurt along with anger. You think supporting other people is calculated? In Hollywood, everything is calculated, Henry. The only difference is that most people are honest about it. Honest about what? Henry demanded. About the fact that they're in it for themselves, Jimmy replied. You've spent decades pretending to be different, pretending to be above all that, when really you're just better at hiding your ambition. The accusation was so wrong, so fundamentally misunderstood Henry's character that he almost didn't know how to respond. Jimmy, I don't know what happened to you or why you've decided to attack me like this, but you're completely wrong about who I am. Am I? Jimmy pressed his advantage. Then explain to me why every story about Henry Winkler is about how wonderful Henry Winkler is. Explain to me how someone supposedly so humble ends up being the subject of constant praise and adoration. Maybe because I try to treat people well, Henry suggested, his voice carrying both anger and genuine confusion about Jimmy's motivations. Or maybe because you've figured out that being the nice guy is the best way to protect your career and your image, Jimmy shot back. Henry felt something break inside him. This wasn't just professional disagreement. This was a systematic destruction of everything he had tried to be throughout his entire life. The betrayal was complete and devastating. You know what, Jimmy? I feel sorry for you, Henry said, his voice now steady with controlled emotion. Don't you dare pity me, Jimmy replied, his anger flaring even higher. I'm not pitying you, Henry said calmly. I'm just recognizing that someone who can't believe in genuine kindness, who has to see calculation and manipulation in every decent act, that person must live in a very dark world. Jimmy's face contorted with rage at the psychological insight. Don't try to psychoanalyze me, Henry. I'm not one of your adoring fans who falls for the wise mentor routine. It's not a routine, Henry replied with devastating sincerity. It's just who I am. And if you can't see that, if you've become so cynical that you can't recognize authentic human decency, then I genuinely feel sorry for what you've become. The words hit Jimmy Kimmel like a physical blow, and his face cycled through emotions too quickly to track. He was a man who had built his career on mocking others, and Henry had just turned that mockery back on him with surgical precision. The studio fell so quiet that the hum of the cameras became audible. What I've become, Jimmy's voice was shaking with fury. What I've become is successful on my own terms, without having to pretend to be something I'm not. Your own terms, Henry repeated thoughtfully. And what terms are those, Jimmy? Building a career on tearing down people who can't fight back? Making millions of people laugh by making individuals feel small and humiliated? The accusation landed with brutal accuracy. Jimmy's entire brand was built on mockery, on finding the humor in other people's failures and embarrassments. He had never been forced to confront the cruelty inherent in that approach, especially not by someone with Henry's moral authority. "I don't tear down people who can't fight back," Jimmy protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Don't you?" Henry asked quietly. "What do you call this, Jimmy? What do you call ambushing a 78-year-old man who came here in good faith to promote children's books?" Jimmy had no answer for that, and his silence only made the accusation more powerful. The audience was riveted, watching a moral reckoning that felt unlike anything they had ever seen on television. "You want to know what I think happened here tonight?" Henry continued, his voice gaining strength from his moral certainty. "I think you've spent so many years making fun of people that you've forgotten how to recognize genuine human goodness when you see it." "Genuine human goodness," Jimmy repeated mockingly, but the mockery felt hollow now, desperate. "Yes," Henry replied simply. "The idea that some people actually try to make the world a little better, a little kinder, without expecting anything in return. The idea that success doesn't have to come at someone else's expense." Jimmy's professional composure was completely shattered now, replaced by something raw and ugly. "You know what your problem is, Henry? You actually believe your own press. You actually think you're as wonderful as everyone says you are." "My problem?" Henry laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Jimmy, my problem is that I trusted you. My problem is that I thought I was talking to a fellow professional who would treat me with basic human decency." "Basic human decency," Jimmy spat. "There's that phrase again. Always comes back to how decent you are, doesn't it, Henry?" "It comes back to how indecent you're being," Henry replied with devastating calm. "It comes back to the fact that you've chosen to use your platform to hurt someone rather than to entertain or inform or inspire." The moral weight of Henry's words was crushing Jimmy, and everyone in the studio could see it. This wasn't just a professional disagreement anymore. It was a fundamental clash between two completely different approaches to life and success. "Get out," Jimmy said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What?" Henry wasn't sure he had heard correctly. "I said get out," Jimmy repeated, his voice now rising to a shout. "Get out of my studio!" Henry stared at him for a long moment, seeing not the successful comedian he had expected to meet, but something smaller and more bitter. "You know what, Jimmy? I'll go. But not because you're ordering me to." "Then why?" Jimmy demanded, his voice cracking with emotion. "Because this conversation is over," Henry said with quiet dignity. "Because there's nothing more to say to someone who's chosen to see the worst in people rather than the best." Henry began walking toward the exit, but Jimmy wasn't finished. As the beloved actor reached the edge of the stage, Jimmy called after him, his voice carrying across the stunned studio. "That's right, Henry. Walk away. Run back to your adoring fans who don't know who you really are." Henry stopped and turned back one final time, his eyes carrying decades of accumulated wisdom and strength. "Jimmy, they know exactly who I am. The question is, do you know who you are?" "I know exactly who I am," Jimmy shouted, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "Do you?" Henry asked quietly. "Because the Jimmy Kimmel I thought I knew wouldn't have done this. The Jimmy Kimmel I respected wouldn't have ambushed a guest for no reason other than his own psychological satisfaction." "My psychological satisfaction?" Jimmy was incredulous. "What other explanation is there?" Henry replied with devastating logic. "I came here to talk about children's books, Jimmy. Children's books. And you turned it into a character assassination. Why would someone do that unless they needed to tear someone down to feel better about themselves?" The question hung in the air like an indictment, and Jimmy had no answer for it. The studio was completely silent, the audience transfixed by watching a moral reckoning unfold in real time. "The saddest thing about all of this," Henry continued, his voice now carrying genuine sadness, is that you have real talent, Jimmy. You could use your platform to build people up, to celebrate human achievement, to make the world a little brighter. Instead, you've chosen this. With that, Henry Winkler walked off the Jimmy Kimmel live stage, leaving behind a studio full of shocked audience members, bewildered crew, and a host whose reputation would never recover from what everyone had just witnessed. The cameras kept rolling as Jimmy stood alone behind his desk, looking like a man who had won a battle but lost his soul in the process. The silence stretched on until Jimmy finally looked directly into the camera, his usual smirk nowhere to be found. "We'll be right back," he managed to say, but everyone knew that nothing would ever really be the same. So what do you think really happened in that studio? Was Jimmy Kimmel's attack on Henry Winkler driven by professional jealousy, personal insecurity, or something even darker? Subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what you think makes someone turn so viciously against a person who represents everything good about Hollywood.